Mara had learned, a long time ago, that the best way to survive in a pack that didn't fully want you was to be useful, not loud, not impressive, not the kind of girl who walked into a room and made people look up from what they were doing. Just useful. Show up. Do the work. Finish the thing no one else wanted to finish. File the report. Track the border. Come back with numbers and maps and 3 pages of notes written in the dark with a flashlight tucked under her chin because batteries were expensive and she wasn't going to waste them by running the whole thing. She had been doing this for 3 years. 3 years of being the girl with the clipboard. 3 years of being useful in the way that a hammer is useful. You pick it up, you do the job, you set it back down. The hammer does not have opinions. The hammer does not have feelings. The hammer is just there when you need it. She was very good at being the hammer. The pack wasn't cruel to her. That was the thing she always reminded herself when the loneliness got too loud. They weren't cruel. They didn't whisper about her when she walked past. They didn't tell her she didn't belong. They just didn't quite see her. She existed in the soft blur at the edge of their attention, close enough to be included, far enough to be forgotten. Her mother had been an Omega, had come to the pack through a marriage that didn't stick, and a bond that dissolved quietly, like sugar in rain. When she died, she left Mara 3 things: a leather jacket with a busted zipper, a decent sense of direction in the dark, and a last name that sat in the pack roster like a small stone in a shoe. Not enough to stop you, just enough to remind you it was there. Voss. Not exactly a legacy, but it was hers. The tribunal happened on a Thursday. Mara had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because she was nervous, she had done tracking reports a dozen times, but because she had a thing about being prepared, about walking into a room with more than what was asked of her. 3 extra maps. 2 backup copies of the written report, color-coded. She was aware this was a little much. She did it anyway. The tribunal room was in the east wing of the main lodge, which smelled the way all old things smelled, cedar and wool, and the specific mustiness of decisions made by people who'd been dead for 100 years. The walls were stone. The floor was stone. There was a long table in the center and a circle marked into the floor with embedded iron, which was tradition, which was dramatic, which Mara had always privately thought was a bit much but was not going to say out loud. She stood at the edge, not in the circle. Omegas, or the daughters of Omegas, or the daughters of disgraced Omegas who'd left without a formal goodbye, didn't stand in the circle. They stood near it, close enough to be heard, far enough to be reminded of the distance. She had stopped minding this, mostly. At the table, Alpha Gregor sat at the head with the expression he always wore in formal settings, which was the expression of a man holding a large invisible weight and doing it gracefully. Elder Vane sat to his left. 3 other elders she knew by sight but not by name filled the rest of the seats, and Callum Hart stood 2 feet to the Alpha's right, arms crossed, face doing the thing it always did in rooms like this. The thing was nothing. His face did nothing. It was very good at that. He had a face that could sit in a tribunal room for 3 hours and give away exactly 0 information, which was useful when you were the Alpha's heir and everything you showed was going to be read and catalogued and repeated. Mara had, over 3 years, spent a probably embarrassing amount of time not looking at that face. She was very good at not looking at it. This was easier before 4 days ago. 4 days ago, on a Sunday, at 3 in the morning, she had been sitting on her kitchen floor, eating cold rice out of a plastic container and watching a documentary about octopuses. She had a theory that the best documentaries were the ones that made you feel better about being strange. Octopuses had 3 hearts and 9 brains and could fit through any hole larger than their beak, which was the size of a walnut. She found this very comforting. And then, in the middle of the part about how octopuses could see color despite technically being colorblind, something in her chest cracked open, not broke, not hurt, just opened. Like a window in a room that hadn't had air in a long time. She sat very still. She knew what it was. She'd read about it. Every pack kid read about it eventually, in the way you read about things that might happen to you, the way you read about lightning strikes and winning the lottery and other events that technically occur but that you never fully believe will be yours. The bond. Mate bond. The one that happens when it decides to happen, not when you're ready, not when it's convenient, not when you are sitting at a table like a normal person, instead of on a kitchen floor at 3 in the morning, surrounded by cold rice. She set down the container. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. She thought, okay then. She thought, for about 2 seconds, about who it was, and then she decided not to think about that, and she went to bed. She went to bed, but she didn't sleep. Obviously, she lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and felt the thing in her chest, warm and certain and completely, absolutely, profoundly uninvited, and she thought about all the ways this was not going to go well. There was a list. It was a long list. Item 1. She was Mara Voss, daughter of an Omega who'd left, pack adjacent, but not pack core, useful in the way hammers are useful, not the kind of girl who gets to have things like this, in a clean and simple way. Item 2. He was Callum Hardick, beta-ranking heir to the alpha position, the kind of man the pack had plans for, the kind of man people built futures around, the kind of man who did not need a complication in the shape of Mara Voss showing up in his chest at 3 in the morning without asking. Item 3. She had no idea what he was going to do about it. That was the item that kept her up the longest. She was not a person who hoped for things. She had learned, the way you learn things that cost you something to learn, that hope was just a way to turn a fact you didn't like into a story with a better ending. And stories with better endings were fine. They were fine, they were lovely, but they had a way of making the actual ending feel worse. She didn't hope, but she waited. She was aware, in the dark, that she was waiting. She hated that she was aware of it. She didn't see him for 2 days. He was there, at the edges of things. She felt it, the way you feel a heat source without looking at it. But they didn't occupy the same room until Tuesday, at a routine check-in at the North Post, where she was handing off the second night's tracking notes and he was reviewing the rotation schedule. They stood 4 feet apart. She did not look at him. He said, "Good report," about the previous week's notes, not even this week's. The previous week's, as if he'd been saving it. She said, "Thanks." And then, because she apparently had no control over her own mouth, the Eastern Ridge entry point is worth watching. The footprint pattern there is off. He said, "I'll flag it." She said, "Okay." He said nothing. She left. She walked back to her small room in the support wing and sat on her bed and pressed both hands against her sternum and thought, "Okay, so we are doing this. We are doing the thing where we pretend. Okay, I can do that. I'm good at that. I've been doing that." The bond hummed. She thought at it. I know. Shut up." On Wednesday, she finished the tracking report. All of it. Every note organized, every grid square accounted for, every recommendation written out clearly with supporting evidence, because if she was going to stand in a room full of people who looked at her the way you look at furniture, not unkindly, just without much interest, she was going to be the most thoroughly prepared furniture they had ever encountered. She went to sleep at midnight. She was up at 4. She went over the report again. The tribunal started at 9. She stood at the edge of the circle and waited for her section. Elder Vane was going through border updates. Alpha Gregor was asking questions in the slow, deliberate way he had of asking questions that already had answers, not because he didn't know, but because making the answer formal and public was the point. She watched the room and did not look at Callum. She looked at the far wall. There was a patch of lighter stone near the upper corner where something had been repaired badly, years ago, and the color never quite matched. She had noticed this before. She thought about it now because it was something to look at that wasn't the thing she wasn't looking at. Voss. Elder Vane gestured toward her without turning his head in her direction. This was his version of eye contact. She accepted it and stepped forward. She gave her report. It took 7 minutes. She'd timed it. 7 minutes, 2 border incursions confirmed, 1 probable, 3 rotation schedule recommendations, and 1 request for additional equipment at the Eastern Post that she knew wasn't going to be approved, but was worth entering into the formal record anyway, because at some point someone was going to have to care about the Eastern Post, and she wanted it on paper that she'd said so first. No one asked questions. This was usual. She stepped back to the edge. She adjusted the reports against her chest and looked at the floor. There was a tile near the base of the circle, cracked, with a thin gray vein running through the lower left corner. She hadn't noticed it before, or maybe she had and had forgotten. The vein ran diagonally, which meant the crack hadn't happened cleanly. Something had pressed wrong, at an angle, and the tile had given in the direction of least resistance. She was thinking about this, the direction of least resistance, when she heard Elder Vane speak again. What about the girl? Not a question. Elder Vane didn't tend toward questions. He made statements shaped like questions, which was a specific kind of authority she had always found exhausting. Voss. He said her name the way you'd say the name of an item on a list. There's been talk. The air in the room changed. She knew how air changed in rooms like this. There was a texture to it, a gathering, like everyone had taken a breath at the same time without deciding to. She looked at the cracked tile. 4 sides. Obviously 4 sides, but she counted them anyway. 1, 2, 3, 4. The gray vein ran from the lower left corner up and to the right, ending before it reached the center. It had stopped. It had almost reached the center and then stopped. She thought about that. Whatever anyone's been saying, Callum's voice. She had heard his voice 100 times, in check-in meetings and patrol briefings, and twice in the main dining hall when she'd been at the far end of the long table and he'd been at the near end, and sound carries. She knew his voice the way you know things that you have spent a long time not paying specific attention to. She kept her eyes on the tile. It isn't real. The gray vein, lower left corner, upward, rightward, stopping. She's nothing to me. 1, 2, 3, 4. The tile had 4 sides. She had been right. And the crack ran from the lower left corner, upward, rightward, and it almost reached the center, and then it stopped. Whatever anyone's been saying, there's nothing there. She's pack support. She does her job. There's nothing between us. Nothing to address. She was looking at the tile. She was absolutely looking at the tile. She noticed, for the first time, that there was a second, smaller crack she'd missed. A hairline, branching off the main vein at almost 90 degrees, running parallel to the lower edge before disappearing into the grout. The room exhaled. She heard it. Little sounds of people settling back into their usual postures. A small collective relaxation. Good, good. No complications. No mess. Nothing to disrupt the order of things. The pack was stable. The air was clear-headed. Pack support did her job. She did her job. She looked at the secondary crack. She thought, I did not know that was there. She left before they dismissed her. This was technically incorrect protocol. You were supposed to wait. You were supposed to stand at the edge of the circle until Elder Vane formally closed the agenda item and moved on, and then you waited until you were released. She did not wait. She walked to the door at the side of the room, not the main doors, the side door, the one that led into the service corridor, the one that she used because it was shorter, and also because she'd spent 3 years finding the routes that didn't require her to move through the middle of things, and she went through it, and she let it close behind her, and she walked. The service corridor was narrow and smelled like cleaning supplies and the kind of fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly unwell. She walked through it and out the side exit into the morning air, which was cold in the way November air is cold. Not violent, just honest, just here. This is the temperature now. Adjust accordingly. She walked the exterior path, then the tree line. Then she kept walking because the alternative was stopping, and she didn't want to stop, because stopping meant standing still with what had just happened in her chest, and she wasn't ready for that. She didn't know if she was going to be ready for that for a while. The bond hummed. It was always there now, this warm hum just below her sternum, like a pilot light, like something that had decided it was home and wasn't going to leave just because it was inconvenient. She had spent 4 days being carefully neutral about it. She had been, she thought, fairly impressive in her neutrality. Very calm, very practical, very Mara Voss, daughter of an Omega, hammer, useful, no opinions, no feelings, no complications. She pressed 2 fingers against her sternum. The hum pressed back. She thought, you are very stupid. You know that. It hummed. She thought, yeah, me too. She walked for almost an hour before she turned back, not back to the lodge, back to her room in the support wing, which was small and smelled like the cedar sachet she kept in the dresser, and had the one window that faced east, which meant it got the morning light, which was the only really good thing about it. She sat on her bed. She opened the tracking report, the copy she kept for herself, the one with her own notes in the margins, the color she never used in the official version because you didn't put your own handwriting in official documents. You kept that part separate. She looked at her own notes. She thought about the eastern ridge, the footprint pattern, the entry point she'd flagged 3 reports in a row now, and that had been acknowledged once, briefly, and then filed. She thought about the cracked tile. She thought about the gray vein that almost reached the center and then stopped. She pulled out her phone. She'd downloaded the app 2 months ago. She'd downloaded it on a Wednesday evening when she was tired, in the specific way that isn't about sleep, the kind of tired that's about something else, the kind that sits in your chest and has opinions. She downloaded it, opened it, looked at the listings for approximately 45 seconds, and then closed it and put her phone face down on the counter and made tea. She'd done this 4 times. Now she opened it. The listings were still there. She'd bookmarked 3. 2 in cities 3 hours away. 1 that was further, 6 hours. A place she'd looked at once on a map and thought, no one there knows my name. No one there has my last name in a roster. No one there would describe me as pack support who does her job. She scrolled to that one. Small apartment, 3rd floor, old building. The photos showed scuffed wood floors and a kitchen with 1 good window and a bathroom where the tile was the kind of institutional white that meant it had been replaced at some point, but not recently. It wasn't charming. It wasn't a find. It was a place where a person could live without being anything specific to anyone. She looked at it for a long time. The bond hummed. She thought, I know. She filled in the contact form. She used the email address she kept for things that were just hers, not the pack address, not the shared system, just a thing she'd made for herself years ago and used for exactly this kind of purpose, for the applications and the subscriptions and the small private digital life she maintained in the narrow space between who she was here and who she might be elsewhere. She hit send. She set the phone face down on the bed. She thought, okay. She thought, well, she thought, that's a thing that happened. She started packing on Friday morning. She didn't make a production of it. She had never been a person who owned a lot of things. That was one of the side effects of growing up in the periphery of something, in the soft blur of its attention. You don't accumulate. You keep things portable. Not because you've been planning to leave, just because something in you understands, quietly and without drama, that you might need to. 2 bags. The leather jacket with the busted zipper, because obviously. Her files, the real ones, the ones with 3 years of tracking notes and maps, and the recommendation for the Eastern Post that no one had acted on. She didn't know why she kept those. They weren't useful to her, specifically, but they felt like proof of something. Not of herself. She didn't need proof of herself. Proof that the Eastern Post needed attention. Proof that she'd said so, in case it ever mattered to someone. The Good Knife. The cephalopod documentary, downloaded. Her small collection of books. Not many. 5, 6. The kind of books that felt like friends, not literature. The kind you read when you need to remember that other people have also felt like this and survived it. Her cedar sachet, because she'd spent good money on that cedar sachet, and she wasn't leaving it. She looked at the room when she was done. It looked the same as it always had. This was the thing about being a hammer. You don't leave a mark. You do the job and you go back to the hook, and the workshop looks the same as it did before you arrived, because that's what tools are for. She turned off the east-facing light. She left a forwarding notation in the pack system, professional, detailed, covering the handoff of her active cases. All 3 rotation schedule recommendations, explained clearly, with supporting documentation, in case anyone decided to act on them. Full briefing notes for whoever picked up the Eastern Post monitoring, complete, organized, signed, pack support who does her job, right to the end. She was gone by Saturday. The bus was at 6:15. She was at the stop at 5:50. which was how she was about things, and she stood in the cold with her 2 bags, and the dawn coming up gray and pink over the tree line, and she thought, with some surprise, that she was not sad. Not yet, maybe. Maybe later. Maybe in 3 weeks when the thing settled in her chest, and she understood all the layers of it, she would feel sad. She reserved the right to feel sad about it later. But right now, standing at the bus stop with her 2 bags in the gray-pink November dawn, she felt something more like the feeling of setting something down after you've been carrying it for a long time. Not relief, exactly. Just the sensation of your arms finding their natural position. The bond was still there. She was not surprised. She'd read enough to know that distance muted it, but didn't stop it. It would take time for the edges to soften. It would be, she understood, a process. She was going to have to feel it do what it did at a distance, like hearing music from another room, clear enough to recognize, far enough to let you pretend you don't. She pressed her fingers to her sternum. You, she thought. Not angry, not even particularly sad. Just you. The bus came. She got on. She found a window seat on the right side because the right side got the sun in the morning, and she'd been cold since before dawn, and she wanted, at minimum, the sun. She got the sun. The pack noticed on Monday. Not the way they'd notice if someone important was gone. Not with alarm, not with a formal acknowledgement. The way you notice a thing is missing when you reach for it, and your hand closes on air. The rotation tracker flagged an unassigned post. Someone at the main office went looking for the tracking notes and found the forwarding notation instead. There was a morning where 3 different people said, at 3 different moments, "Where's Voss?" And the answer was always some version of "I'm not sure," check with, and then trailing off, and then checking, and then finding the notation. She had left documentation for everything. Of course she had. Callum found out on Saturday. He'd gone to the supply room to cross-reference some notes from the Eastern Ridge, the Eastern Post, specifically, the entry point she'd flagged in her report on Thursday, the one that had been in the room with him when he'd said what he'd said, when she'd been standing at the edge of the circle looking at the floor. He'd found himself thinking about it since Thursday, not about the entry point, about the floor, about the fact that she'd been looking at the floor the entire time, and the way she'd held that report against her chest, and the way she'd left before she was supposed to, through the side door. He'd almost gone after her. He'd stood in the tribunal room with Elder Vane still talking about rotation schedules, and he'd thought about the side door, and about going through it, and about what he would say if he did. He hadn't gone. He'd stood in the room and he'd let her leave, and then he'd spent 4 days with the shape of that decision sitting in his chest next to the other thing that was already there, and he'd been very disciplined about both of them, because he was always disciplined. It was the thing he was best at. It was the thing that had been asked of him since before he was old enough to understand what was being asked. The supply room was empty. Not just empty of Mara, empty in the way that rooms are empty when the person who organized them has taken everything that was theirs. The shelves were still there. The filing system was still there. The labels she'd made for the tracking binders, neat, clear, color-coded, were still there. But her jacket wasn't on the hook. Her backup copies weren't in the drawer. The small notepad she kept on the corner of the desk, the one with the blue ink and her particular handwriting that was smaller than it should have been for the size of her hands, was gone. He stood in the room. He stood there longer than he would have told anyone about. The bond, which he had been exquisitely disciplined about since Sunday night, since the moment it had arrived in his chest at an hour when he'd been standing at a window, looking at the dark, like he did sometimes when the lodge got too full and too loud and he needed one room that didn't have expectations in it. The bond pulled. Not gently. He pressed his fist against the center of his chest and stood in the room that still smelled faintly like cedar. He thought about what he'd said. He had said nothing to me. He had said it in the flat, certain way he said things that needed to be communicated efficiently and without ambiguity, the way he gave information in rooms full of people who were reading him for what to think. He had said it because Elder Vane had said there's been talk in that specific way that meant this is a potential disruption, address it or I will, and I will do it less kindly. He had said it because the pack needed him to be straightforward, needed the succession clear, needed no complications. He had said it because he was always the thing the pack needed him to be, and he was very good at it, and he had never once, not in 27 years, stopped to ask what that cost. Nothing to me. She does her job. He sat down on the floor of the supply room. He sat on the floor the way a man sits when his legs have decided before his brain has caught up. He sat with his back against the shelving unit and his arms on his knees, and he thought about what she'd looked at while he was talking. The floor. She'd been looking at the floor. And she hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't made a sound, just held the report against her chest and looked at the floor and then, very quietly, left. He was beginning to understand the difference between a decision and a consequence. He'd made decisions before, lots of them, considered ones, careful ones, the kind of decisions that had been laid out in front of him since childhood like a map. This road, this turn, this destination, this is how the heartline does things. This is what an heir does. This is who you are in rooms like that one. He had made the decision on Thursday, in the room. The consequence had apparently packed 2 bags and gotten on a bus. He sat on the floor for a while. She found out later, from a contact who still had pack ties, that he'd asked after her. Not officially, not through channels, quietly, the way people ask about things they don't want on record. Someone who worked the front office told someone who told someone. The way information moves in places with pack structures, always through the side routes, always arriving already warm from other hands. She was in her new apartment when she heard. 3rd floor, scuffed wood floors, the kitchen with the one good window, the institutional white bathroom tile that had been replaced at some point but not recently. It smelled like old plaster and someone else's previous life. She was eating rice, hot this time, from the good pot she'd bought at the second-hand shop 2 streets over, and watching the octopus documentary, which she had seen 4 times at this point and which she found, every time, deeply comforting. She heard the information. She sat with it. The bond hummed, at distance, softened the way music is softened by a closed door. You can hear its playing. You can almost make out the shape of the song. She pressed her fingers to her sternum. Yeah, she thought. I know. The documentary got to the part about the 3 hearts. She thought about that. 3 hearts. The octopus has 3 hearts, 1 to pump blood to the body and 2 smaller ones to pump it specifically to the gills. The body heart actually stops beating when the octopus swims, which is why they prefer crawling. Swimming costs too much, she thought. That's a lot of hearts for one animal. She thought, that seems excessive. She thought, completely unnecessary. She finished her rice. Outside, the city moved around her the way cities move. Loud, various, entirely uninterested in anything specific about her. Cars, someone's music, a dog somewhere with opinions about something. The ordinary noise of a world that didn't know her name, didn't know her file, didn't know the crack in the tile or the gray vein, or the day she'd stood at the edge of a circle and counted 4 sides and found a second crack she hadn't noticed. She pulled up the housing app, not to look at other places, just to look at the confirmation of this one. The lease she'd signed, the address that was now hers, in her name, an address where she was no one's nothing, because she was simply no one's anything, and that was geography, not a verdict, and those were 2 different things. She closed the app. She thought about the eastern ridge, the footprint pattern, 3 reports. She pulled out her small notepad, the one with the blue ink and her particular handwriting, and she started writing up what she'd noticed in the last sector before she left, the way the ridge entry had shifted east by approximately 12 feet over 4 weeks, which suggested an established path rather than random crossings, which meant whoever was using it had been using it long enough to build a route. She wrote it up, organized, clear. She was going to send it to no one. She was going to write it for the record that only she kept, in the notepad, in her own handwriting, because she'd seen it, and she'd said so, and that was enough. It was going to have to be enough. She did not think about him all the time. She thought about him the way you think about a song you heard at a moment you didn't know was important. Not always, not every second, but when the conditions were right, when the light was a certain way, or the air smelled like November, or she reached into her chest looking for something and found the hum instead. She thought, okay. She thought, you are going to feel this for a while. That's fine. You can feel it. It doesn't have to mean anything. It can just be a thing you feel, and then you finish your rice and you go to sleep, and you get up and you do the thing the next day. She was, it turned out, very good at this. She found work in the new city. Research work, mostly. The kind of pattern tracking she was good at. The kind that required someone to sit with data in the dark and notice the things that didn't quite fit the expected shape. It turned out there was more need for that kind of work than she'd expected. It turned out she was not just useful to one specific pack in one specific territory. She was useful in a different, freer way. The way something is useful when it is no longer confined to one job. The apartment stopped smelling like someone else's previous life around week 3. She added her cedar sachet to the dresser. She put 3 books on the windowsill. The east-facing one, Good Morning Light, same as always. She bought a second pot. She started, slowly, building the particular kind of life that is made of small good habits instead of belonging. She thought, sometimes, that there was a word for this kind of life, but she didn't need to know the word. The word would arrive when she was ready for it. She was not ready for it yet. She was still in the part where you finish your rice and go to sleep. She was very good at that part. He found out where she was on a Tuesday. He didn't go immediately. That would have been easy, in the way that impulsive things are easy, fast, uncomplicated by the slowness of thinking. He was not by nature impulsive. He was the kind of man who stood in empty supply rooms for too long, the kind of man who made careful decisions with poor consequences, the kind of man who had spent his entire life being the thing that was needed and had never once asked if the thing that was needed was also the thing that was good. He stood in the supply room again. He kept coming back to it, which said something, and he thought about the cracked tile, about what Mara had been looking at, about the side door, about the forwarding notation she'd left. Complete, organized, right to the end. He thought, she was in that room the entire time. She heard every word. She looked at the floor, and she counted something, and then she walked out the side door, and she did every handoff correctly, and she left. He thought, and I did not go after her. He thought, I knew she was there. I knew she could hear. I said it anyway. Not because it was true, because it was useful. That was the thing, the specific ugly shape of the thing. He had not said it because it was true. He had said it because it was useful, because Elder Vane needed an answer, and the answer needed to be clean and public and unambiguous, and he had been trained his whole life to give clean and public and unambiguous answers in rooms like that one, to be the thing the pack could rely on. He had been very reliable. She had been standing at the edge of the circle counting tiles while he was reliable. He stayed in the supply room for a long time. He came back 2 days in a row. He kept sitting on the floor, which was not a thing he'd done before, sitting on floors. He didn't know when that had started. On the 3rd day he drove to the bus station and bought a ticket. She was in the kitchen when the knock came. 6 in the evening, Wednesday. She was making rice. She was going through a rice phase. She had decided this was a phase. She was not going to analyze why she kept making rice. It was simple and warm and required enough attention to be something to do. And she had the documentary on in the background, a different one this time, this one about migratory birds, and she had her notepad open to the Eastern Ridge notes that she still had not sent to anyone. The knock was 3 times. Not urgent. Not the knock of an emergency. Just a knock. She stood in the kitchen for 1 moment. She thought, okay. She went to the door. She opened it. He looked, different than she expected, which was strange because she hadn't expected anything specific. But he looked different. He looked like a man who had sat on a floor a few times and was still figuring out what he thought about that. He looked less like a cliff face, more like a cliff face that had noticed it could move and was not entirely sure what to do with the information. He had nothing in his hands, no formal documentation, no prepared speech. This, she thought, was new. She held the door. He said, "Can I come in?" Not a question exactly, but not the flat certainty of the tribunal room either. Something in between. She looked at him. She thought, I am not going to hope. I made a rule about that. She thought, I am also aware that I'm holding this door open. She said, you drove 6 hours. He said, "I know." She said, "That's a lot for someone who has nothing to address." He didn't look away. He said, "Yes, it is." She held the door. The bond hummed, not quietly, not at distance, the full, close, warm, certain hum of a thing that has been waiting and recognizes what waiting was for. She thought, "Shut up." It hummed. She thought, "Yeah, I know." She stepped back. She let him in. She did not know what came next. She reserved the right to not know. She reserved the right to feel sad about it later, to be furious about it later, to have the full, complicated, loud, extended reaction to "she's nothing to me" that she had swallowed in a tribunal room because she'd had a floor to look at and a tile to count. Later she would feel all of it. Right now she went back to the kitchen. She said, "Sit somewhere, I'm finishing the rice." He sat at the table. She didn't look at him. She stirred the rice. The documentary played in the background. A bird, somewhere over the Atlantic, navigating by magnetic field, finding north without being taught how, crossing oceans without a map, arriving because that's what it was built to do. She thought about that. She stirred the rice. She thought, "I have not forgiven you. I want that to be clear. I have not decided anything. I stepped back from a door, and that is the entire extent of what I have decided." She thought, "The rice needs 2 more minutes." The bond hummed. She thought, "I know, but you don't get to make this simple. That's not how this works." It hummed. She thought, 2 minutes. Outside, the city moved the way cities move. The dog had opinions, cars, music from somewhere. She finished the rice. She set 2 bowls on the table. She sat down. She looked at him for the first time since the door. She thought, "Okay." She thought, "Well," she thought, "I still have not forgiven you. I still do not hope. I still have my 2 bags and my cedar sachet, and my Eastern Ridge notes that I wrote for no one. And I still got up every morning for 3 weeks in this city that didn't know my name, and I still made rice, and I still watched the octopus documentary, and I am still, entirely, a person who exists without you, and I need you to know that before anything else happens in this room." She did not say any of this. She said, "It's just rice." He said, "That's fine." She said, "I know." And they ate. And outside, the migratory bird on the documentary navigated by magnetic field across the Atlantic and found north without a map and kept flying.